We will be continuing with the program by recognizing examples of practical works that are being done locally to build bridges of understanding and facilitate civil dialogue. Our next two presenters are local clergy who are perfect examples of this. The first is Reverend Colleen Ogle, Associate Pastor at the King Avenue United Methodist Church. Reverend Ogle hosted a 13-week class on Christianity and Islam at her church using the book Christianity and Islam by Ron Kerr as the guide for each week's topic of learning and discussion. Now, the course presented a side-by-side comparison of the two religions, and as a result, offered the participants opportunities to discuss some rather sensitive issues in a critical manner, which was always done in a respectful and collegial way. It was a privilege for me to take part in the course as a co-facilitator and learn from the group's participation as well as Reverend Ogle's example. So please welcome Reverend Colleen Ogle to share her thoughts on this experience.
Before I get started, I want to tell you how I got motivated to lead that class that Fazil was so gracious to be part of. In my current setting, King Avenue United Methodist Church, we live in the shadow of Ohio State University. And in November of 2015, someone came to the church to ask for help and asked to see a pastor. And when he came back to my office, I saw a very fine, nicely dressed young man, polite, very thin, spoke with a very quiet voice. And as I talked to him, expecting to hear, usually when students stop by to talk to a pastor, they're in some kind of existential crisis, usually prompted by a rejected love. But this young man was very different. He was talking quietly, I learned, because he was hungry. And he also had a heart condition and had not had his medication. As I started talking with him more, and in fact then as we went and bought groceries and stopped by the pharmacy, I listened to his story more. And he was a senior at OSU in neurosciences, planning to go to medical school. His family was he was first generation Somali. His parents were in North Carolina with two other siblings. And it was getting close to the end of the semester. The new check for all of his tuition had not yet come, and he was completely out of money. He hadn't eaten for 4 days. During the course of our afternoon, as I talked with him, and he looked around before we left our sanctuary and commented on different features of it, I asked, do your parents know that you need help right now? He said, I think they really have their hands full. There are two other kids, and my mom's a nurse. They're working hard, so I didn't push more. After a little while, as we'd been going through our collection of things, I said, do you have a congregation that you could reach out to? Because I thought he may need more help later on in the year. And he didn't say a lot, but it seemed to me that he was a little bit reluctant to identify himself by his faith tradition in the context of being a student at the university. And my heart went out to him for that. And it gave me a glimpse of what it might be like to be a Muslim in the United States. And so at the end of our time, I told him I really wanted him to make it to medical school because let me tell you, the character and the ethic I saw in that young man was inspiring. And I wanted him to be someone who would give care to people in need in the future. And I tried to keep a little bit in contact with him, sent him a gift card for some food a little bit later, got his address. I only heard back from him once, though. He sent me a lovely thank you email in which he recalled growing up in North Carolina. Of course, he was around a whole bunch of Christian people, and every now and then some of his friends would get him to go to things, and he'd heard the story of the Good Samaritan. And he said, I just realized I think that you are a Good Samaritan. I'm confident that he made it into medical school, and I was so glad to be part of his journey. Sadly, I cannot remember his name, and it's because I'm horrible at any language. Really, I'm not even that great at English, but I'm horrible at any language other than my own, and I'm pretty sure I was never confidently able to pronounce his name, so let's call him Bob. That was November of 2015. In November of 2016, as many of you know, there was Columbus, a young man who was an engineering student at OSU who had been radicalized by ISIS propaganda, and we had our first homegrown terrorist incident on the campus of OSU. Thankfully, it was not catastrophic, except it was tragic, and it brought home to our little town some of the fears that were more a concern of others outside of Columbus. And immediately my thoughts went to Bob and other students like Bob who had already been frightened about what other people would think or assume about them and how much worse this might make their situations. And I decided I needed to try to do whatever I could. And I have to tell you, although I have always been interested in interfaith work, my study had been in Hinduism and Buddhism, and I absolutely knew nothing about Islam, sadly. But it started me thinking that I should do something, and I actually called a professor up at Methesco, the Methodist Theological School in Ohio, in interreligious dialogue, and asked him for a resource for helping lead people in understanding Islam. The things that he recommended to me were so scholarly and intellectual, I knew I would never get a class to take a look in that much depth at anything related to Islam, that I needed something for a lay audience. So I started looking around and found this resource that Fazil talked about, which was not a great resource. And boy, did I feel with not a good resource, I felt with my lack of knowledge like a bumbling idiot going into this endeavor. But I had planned it, and I wondered if anyone would come, and then our president kind of upped the ante and got people really interested in learning more so that they could not be part of the prejudice that they saw tainting our highest office. And because of that, I had about 30 people come to our classes for 13 weeks. Now, in order to make it a good experience, I felt like it was really important that there needed to be some people who are practitioners of Islam also in the class, so that we weren't just reading materials that had been produced by a Christian about Islam. And I wanted to have Islamic speakers there, but I didn't know where to start. I didn't know any. So I put word out to the staff and anybody in the class, if you know any Muslims, bring them along. Fortunately, one of our staff people had met Fazil, and he was the most incredible, gracious ambassador of Islam. and just a delightful person. I think that if you had run for president, after the class, all of our class people would have campaigned for you. So, 13 weeks, we put a sandwich board sign out on the curb so that people driving by would know we were having a class on Christianity and Islam. And not only people from the church, but people from the neighborhood came because they were interested. Most of them were Christians, but some were Muslims. There were physicians from OSU who were there to study and doing their internships and residencies who stopped by a couple evenings. There was Joe the barber who was in the barber shop around the corner who was a convert to Islam, and native-born Ohioan who came several times, and anyone who was there who wanted the opportunity after we did our little formal study to have an open mic, I invited to take the open mic and tell their stories. And then whenever we had questions, Fazil was there most nights and would give us more scholarly answers. So we did a lot of talking and listening. It's interesting, we did the study of Christianity and Islam on a whole lot of topics. In 13 weeks, you can't go very deep on anything. And maybe we would have had more time to learn about Islam if we hadn't done Christianity and Islam, but what I found was that it was really helpful for the Christians in the class to understand their religion as if you're standing outside and looking at categories, because we don't see ourselves inside a faith as people from outside might analyze us. And it gave people a lot of perspective and some humility, particularly when we dealt with topics like war and violence, roles of women, things that were controversial. It was helpful to give people perspective on Christianity's history and practices. So, with that, after all of this time, when Fazil asked me to do this, I sent questionnaires out to the 35 people who I still had contact with, who'd been in the class, to ask them some simple questions. And the first question was, did the class on Christianity and Islam have an impact on your overall impression of the Muslim faith and of Muslims in general? If so, describe the impact. And I'm going to share some of their answers with you. I got responses from 9 people, and from the people who responded, there was a range in educational levels and previous experience, but there was, among our respondents, a civil engineer, a licensed independent social worker, a young man who works in a pizza shop and factory, 2 jobs, a millennial trying to make a living. There was a retired OSU linguistics professor, someone who works in corporate financial services, a public school teacher, an Army reservist, and pharmacy technician. The age range was from 35 years to 85 years, the participants in the class, actually 30 years to 85 years. So, I'm not going to share all of their responses, but some of the ones that really jumped out at me. Did the class on Christianity and Islam have an impact on your overall impression of the Muslim faith and Muslims in general? Here's one woman's response. To be honest, before taking the class, I was Islamophobic. I had great distrust and fear of Islamic people. I recall sitting in the class the first couple of weeks feeling hypervigilant because I'd not been around so many people of that faith, and I feared they might try to harm us in some way. As they began to share the stories of their lives and faith experiences, I came to understand that they, nor the majority of the followers of Allah, have no desire nor intent to harm Christians. Their stories and warmth changed my mind and heart. From another man, the class gave me a more positive view of Muslims. The class and the Muslim students emphasized that it was a religion of peace, and the fundamentalists we associate with the religion are a minority. I learned that Muslims are actually very concerned with social welfare by giving to others and taking care of the elderly. This is what people remember after a year and a half, so. Here's a comment from the young man who works in the pizza shop and the factory. Misunderstanding is the mother of fear and hate. I've rejected many opinions passed around the pizza shop and factory, not knowing if they were truthful. The most impactful things I learned involved the similarities between the faiths. Having a better understanding of Islam's history and central tenets helped me see why people's opinions lack context. Here's one I just can't help but share. I can't overstate how much having Fazil in class meant to each one of us and added to the value. He was so open to answering our questions and giving his knowledge of his faith. I also asked them if, the last question, I won't share you all the questions I asked. The last question I asked them was, did the class leave you more, less, or the same in terms of your assessment for the possibility of civil harmony in a religiously diverse society? One woman said, my very positive experience in our class has helped me immensely. I work in a setting in which about 70% of the staff are people of Islamic faith and about 40% of my clients are Islamic. I know enough about the faith to allow me the ability to speak with them about it and honor them by being aware of their holidays and celebrations. I have several friends now who practice Islam, and we discuss our faith and religious practices openly, but with great respect for each other. I have learned even more of the Islamic faith from my discussions with my friends since the class at King Ave. The class and interactions since then have helped me to see how smug many Christians can be in terms of their beliefs and how they feel the need to denigrate others instead of having open minds and open hearts with respect to our Muslim brothers and sisters. I'm grateful that God has opened my heart through this positive experience. I totally believe through classes and forums such as this, people can learn to respect and live together peacefully. I was someone who is ignorant in my mind and heart about the faith and people of Islam, but through their gracious sharing of their stories, my heart has been open to acceptance, respect, and love for those who have now become my friends. Someone else said, the class left me cautiously hopeful. I feel that most Christians and Muslims wish for peace and harmony in the world, but many of our world leaders, mostly ours, wish to exploit our differences using fear and ignorance to divide us. Someone else said, I think that listening and learning always helps to create harmony. I think that the Muslims who attended the class were well received and their thoughts and ideas were respected. For myself, I think that in the back of my mind there were always questions about human rights and women's rights that maybe could have been explored more. But I think the class was more about mutual understanding, and Christians have not always taken the best positions on those issues. And then finally, my pizza shop man. It's complicated, he said. This is in response to, does he feel more or less optimistic? It's complicated because people feel their religion is right and others are wrong. I unfortunately have little faith in the capacity of people to be tolerant, but I will personally endeavor to give people my time and willingness to learn. So my takeaway lessons from this experience, first of all, I had to resolve just to take a leap. I did not know how to do it, and I always felt pretty awkward about being someone who was a religious professional but was leading something by admitting my ignorance and my need to learn. But just take a leap and get started. Invest in relationships, because people to people, being ambassadors and listening, make the biggest impact. Look for great partners. I kind of believe that if you send out the request to God for help to do something good, it will come, and Fazil came, and many others did too. And they had different opinions and different traditions that were represented, and that was good and healthy to see. And then finally, I had to kind of squash my pride about knowing how things would turn out and whether or not it would work out, but just trust that God, who is at work in our traditions and is being light for the world, would provide and guide. So I now feel convicted that I need to get back on this work again. Thank you.
Thank you so much.